One of the biggest takeaways from India's G20 is that the African Union will be given membership of the G20 invited to the high table under the presidency of Prime Minister Modi. The one Indian businessman who spent a huge amount of his time, energy and effort in cultivating the India-Africa relationship is Sunil Bharti, founder and chairperson of Bharti Enterprises, chair of the B20 Africa wing. So he's joining us now live and exclusive on India Today. Mr. Mittal, as somebody who's invested so much in Africa over the decades, can you give us a sense at the beginning of what you think would be the advantages of inviting Africa Union and helping it become a member of the G20? Welcome, Mr. Mittal.
Thank you. It's a delightful day for India. I would say what we have achieved in session one of getting AU included as a permanent member on G20 was without a doubt one of the big, bold declarations of the day, adopted unanimously by all the members. And I was just watching on your channel that we have had the second session start with another big bang announcement that the Delhi Declaration has been adopted, which I mentioned earlier in the morning on another channel. And I remain very hopeful that India's leadership in getting a consensus from all, even on some of the most contentious issues, will be achieved, seems to have been achieved. I'm sure all of us will look forward to seeing the fine print and language, but diplomacy is the art of finding the right nuance in every language to get everybody on board. I think the Indian leadership, ministers, the Sherpa, all have worked very hard to get to something which we eagerly look forward to. Delhi Declaration, being a consensus declaration, will, to my mind, be one of the major hallmarks of G20, India's G20 year. Coming back to Africa, I have been working in Africa for 14 years now. We not only have significant investments, I have personally been leading the India-Africa Business Council for long years and had the great privilege to chair the Africa Economic Integration Council at the B20, an area which I know the Prime Minister wants to leave a very big legacy behind his G20 presidency.
Soon after the B20 got over in the capital, I know you flew to Africa. Could you give our viewers a sense of how countries in Africa are looking at the kind of effort India has invested in trying to get the African Union on board, inviting a country like Nigeria, pushing so hard through the G20 to ensure that the African Union gets this membership? How are countries in Africa looking at this?
I think they are really looking at India as a leader of not only just global South, but in particular focus towards Africa. I went and met a number of heads of states in Africa in the last 1 year of run-up of B20, Nigeria, Kenya, Congo, Zambia, and many others. And I would say everybody was very keen for India to take a strong leadership position as a champion of Africa and African Union in the G20. That India has been able to achieve this will be fondly remembered forever in Africa. I personally believe Africa will owe this particular inclusion in G20 to India and India's leadership. And given that India has had historic relationships with the African continent, which it had lost a little bit in the last 8-10 years to other countries, especially China, I think this is a strong comeback of India in a very powerful and dramatic way. It will help Indian businesses to set up shops in Africa, set up factories there, go and start new businesses there. And I can tell you, with what has happened today, Indians will be more welcome than ever before in the entire African continent.
India has been reaching out to Africa in a structured way since 2008, but a country like China, you mentioned China, that outreach started around 2000 when Jiang Zemin was president, and since then the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation began its ministerial meetings in Beijing and elsewhere, and they've really tried very hard through initiatives like the Belt and Road to build deep linkages with Africa, and in some cases causing indebtedness in these African countries as well. Do you see this as an inevitable contestation between India and China, one wanting to be the voice of the global south, the other thinking of itself as the natural leader of the global south?
No, absolutely. There is a very stark difference in how China has approached Africa and how India has maintained its engagement with Africa. China has given tons of money. There's no question about that. They wrote big checks. But against those monies, they secured commitments for contracts on mining, critical metals and minerals, a lot of extractive businesses, which have not helped the African countries. In fact, they have indebted them to a point where they are now in deep distress, some of them at a point where they will default, and some have defaulted. On the other hand, India, while it did not write big checks, provided a lot of technology support, a lot of diplomatic support, a lot of political support, and also through Exim Bank gave due amounts of soft loans and grants as well, not to the levels that China was giving, but there was nothing in exchange for that we will go and extract critical minerals and metals out of Africa. So wherever I'm going now, I am seeing through the African leadership a different way of looking at India as compared to China. They are trying to get their debts waived off by China. They are trying to knock at the doors of UN and other agencies, including EU and OECD, to waive off their loans. Whereas on the Indian side, they're seeking digital public infrastructure from India. They are seeking Indian businessmen to come and set up cement, steel, pharmaceutical plants. And during COVID, India's support on vaccines to Africa is also highly acknowledged and remembered.
Yours is the second largest telecom operation in Africa. You operate in 14 markets, primarily in East Africa, Central and West Africa, but you've also burnt your fingers in countries like Botswana, where you tried to set up operations but failed. But from there, it's been quite a journey. At a macro level, can you share your takeaways on the similarities, dissimilarities, the challenges of dealing with Africa as a continent relative to how it is to do business in India?
Well, I would say Africa is certainly significantly behind India in terms of infrastructure. Setting up towers, putting up fiber is not easy. A lot of stuff has to be imported. Local industry doesn't have enough support system or supply chain to support your businesses. So it is difficult. Currency depreciation has been a great cause of concern. In some of the countries, getting dollars is a very, very difficult proposition. And as you know, in the telecom industry, most of the equipment is imported. Devices have to be imported. Network has to be imported. So there are challenges. I will not underestimate the challenges. But this is a continent of hope. 1.4 billion people with the fastest growing population anywhere in the world. Land mass, which is 10 times the size of India. A lot of alluvial, fertile land across the Congo Basin, critical minerals and metals. If the world focuses on Africa, there is much to be done there. It will take a decade or two for Africa to be lifted out of its difficulties. But imagine once it can economically develop itself, some infrastructure can be put into place. Africa can actually resolve a lot of problems of the world, including world hunger. They can produce so much food even with 10% of their land put to use. All the critical minerals and metals which are required for electric vehicles and new age energy, all that is there. And of course, young people who are available to work for the world. So I would say it is not going to be easy doing business in Africa, but people who are doing businesses there for a long period of time can tell you that the potential remains very strong. Airtel continues to grow at 20% year on year in Africa. There is no other place in the world that is growing as fast. So opportunities and challenges go hand in hand in Africa.
You chair the B20 India Action Council on African Economic Integration. Can you give us a sense of what all came out of the B20 and what do you see as being the next steps on the back of this big inclusion of the African Union in the G20? What do you see as being the next incremental steps?
Well, the B20 on the Africa Integration Council looked at one thing, which was what Prime Minister directed the B20 to look at, was to see how Africa as a continent can start to work a lot more between themselves. You'll be surprised to note that it's very difficult to do business cross borders within the African Union. And that is an area where we wanted to highlight our work. The AFCFTA, the Africa equivalent of the FTA for the entire continent, has been signed by now most of the 55 member countries of the African Union. The idea was, how can you move material and men through borders of Africa? A lot of the countries are landlocked. For them to access oceans for shipping and getting their shipments in was difficult. To take flights from one country to another, sometimes you have to go to Europe, into Paris, and down back into Africa, have more linkages between the countries. One of the most important pillars was agriculture. How to get the world's attention towards agriculture development in Africa, both basic produce, but also value-added food production in Africa, which can mitigate the current issues of Ukraine, grain supply, etc., which is really affecting a lot of people in Africa. The other area was the digital piece. While it'll take some decades for hard infrastructure to come up, India has shown, and as you have seen in the World Bank report, what India would have done in 47 years for financial inclusion has been done in 6 years. The same lifting and shifting of DPI from India, the digital public infrastructure, into Africa, country by country, can accelerate the development of these African countries. And I think that is the second pillar. And of course, there were many others. I don't want to bore you with all the 5 or 6 details, but these are the two flagship issues that we raised: the agriculture and food program and the digital development in Africa.
Lastly, and of course it's a massive continent, so there can't be any one answer, but between the time you went to Africa in the late 90s to now, how have you seen things change? What makes you most optimistic? What leaves you with maximum concern?
Well, one of the most optimist thing is that you have a continent which is growing in population. It has young people, whereas the world is aging all across. India is an exception, of course. In fact, there is a study which says during our next generation, the population of Nigeria alone will be greater than China, which means Nigeria will move from 250 million to 700 million people, and China will shrink to 700 million people. Just put that into perspective. Africa is going to be 3 billion people in the next generation, young people wanting goods and services and equally engaging with the world. If you put that in perspective, the next 10, 20, 30 years, the world should focus onto Africa. And that is where, to my mind, India's leadership now, in relation to Africa, holds a great deal of promise for our industry, our businesses. And I personally feel all those who are looking towards growing outside India should start to focus on Africa. Well, US, in October last year, President Biden invited all the heads of states from Africa, committed $55 billion in the next 3 years to Africa. The world is waking up. Everybody wants to engage with Africa now. And difficulties, yes, don't get scared when you go to Africa. There are infrastructure issues. There are problems in getting electricity in the right places, but it's getting better and better.
Well, you were ahead of your time when you went there. Now it is indeed time for Africa and the G20, most certainly, and as the next big growth engine of the global economy. Sunil, Bharti, Mittal, for joining us on India Today. Thank you very much, sir.